ลำดับถัดไปนะครับจะเป็นการนำเสนอจากวิทยากรต่างประเทศนะครับผมโดยในการนำเสนอจะใช้ภาษาอังกฤษนะครับแต่เราก็มีบริการหูฟังแปลภาษาไทยให้ทุกท่านนะครับถ้าหากท่านใดยังไม่ได้รับหูฟังสามารถรับได้ที่จุดลงทะเบียนที่ชั้น5นะครับเพื่อใช้ในการฟังแล้วก็จะขอรบกวนให้ทุกท่านคืนหูฟังก่อนเวลาเที่ยงครึ่งด้วยนะครับเพราะว่าเดี๋ยวช่วงบ่ายเราจะกิจกรรมของเราจะเป็นภาษาไทยนะครับ and now is the time for keynote address. The first keynote address is titled We make the museum as we learn, storytelling as a bridge between education and exhibitions. And our first keynote speaker is Dr.Ana Maria Theresa LABRADOR, the Assistant Director of the National Museum of the Philippines. Please welcome Dr.Ana Maria Theresa LABRADOR.
Everyone, thank you for having me here. It's such a privilege. I was in the museum forum last year, and this is really something because I do like presenting what we're doing at the museum and to see also the context within our region and also in Asia. So I've put the title because I think that the title should reflect what we're doing at the museum, that every time we learn from the museum, we actually remake and retell the story of the museum. So I've put in this abstract just to give you a brief overview of what I want to talk about. And it has something to do with our recent work at the museum that focuses on the reorganization of the National Museum. We have been very lucky to have 235 more staff positions, and coming from a very requiring a higher qualification. So, but we think that the work should not be confined to only one department, and so what we've been doing is actually embedding the work of education within all these departments concerned. But I want to also focus on the context of museology in Southeast Asia. And I think it's important that we consider that to focus on our region too. And just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from when I talk about museology, I really want to focus on the interdisciplinary work of the museum, and that we should also look at it in the context of heritage. Just the notions that I've been getting, and also has to do with my study as a social anthropologist, is that tradition is really not the past in Southeast Asia. And I want to focus on the idea of duality and tripartitioning in our practices in Southeast Asia. So this is one scene where we actually engage with young people in the museum. They're actually facing one of the biggest paintings in the museum, and it's a way of also to encourage taking pride in the accomplishments of our ancestors in terms of culture and heritage. So the idea of duality in Southeast Asia is really this notion of binarism that we promote in anthropological studies, no? And that, for instance, looking at two sides of most issues, such as hot and cold, raw and cooked, and all that. And they actually exist when we do our studies in the field, we find out that this actually exists in terms of people's practices. The other is actually tripartitioning in Southeast Asia, and it has to do with certain notions of, studying also the in-betweenness and the transitory phases of rituals, for instance. And it comes out in objects, and for instance in textiles that we have in Southeast Asia, where we actually have, for instance, the what they call this, the middle field, the center field, and then we also have the sides, no? And so the three areas, but at the same time we also have the end fields, and quite important in when you think about textiles that are produced in Southeast Asia. So I have quite a lot of teachers. I'm a lifelong learner, actually. And so when I go out in the field, I actually talk to, we're now coming to a phase where people who used to be what we call informants are now our co-authors. And that's being changed also in the laws when we do research with indigenous people. So my background in museum education has something to do with my being a social anthropologist, but I've been told that I should also emphasize that I was an academic for 22 years before joining the National Museum. I also really want to focus more in terms of my work at the museum, the idea of material culture studies, looking at technologies and material behavior especially in tropical conditions. And I also am very mindful of the UNESCO program on Intangible Heritage, because what has been happening is it's more difficult to do documentation of intangible heritage. I also would like to focus on the ownership of objects and heritage, and that this has led to a shift in our museum practice. And also in terms of SPAFA, Simeo SPAFA's flagship projects, because, for instance, in the focus of the spiritual dimension of rice, that has also filtered through what we're doing in the Philippines. So just to give you a brief overview of the institution where I come from, this is the National Museum's flagship campus in Manila. We actually have this is the National Museum of Fine Arts, the National Museum of Anthropology, and this is soon to open the National Museum of Natural History. We actually have somewhere hidden behind there is a planetarium. We also look after that. So this is our mandate. We have our own law that was framed in 1998, and it has a lot to do with the UNESCO definition of what a museum should be. The International Council of Museums also define museums as a permanent institution. It's non-profit, and it's really to benefit, it's for social good. So we have a threefold mandate. We are an educational institution. So we actually help disseminate knowledge that we gather from the field and also in the study of collections. We are a scientific institution. We're very lucky that the Philippines is actually one of the mega biodiverse hotspots in the world, and that's why we have to open a natural history museum to celebrate that. We are also a cultural center, so we have exhibitions, public programs, and we have outreach programs too. So what have we done with our department of the museum education? We've actually dismantled it, and that's the conflict part of this discussion, this keynote. A lot of people were not very happy about it when we were doing the reorganization plan. But we thought that perhaps we should really embed museum education, the programs, in our technical or research divisions. And we want audiences rather than just viewers. We want them to actually respond to our programs. And we don't like the idea that there's so many pre-digested information passing through different departments, different people. So we'd like to actually have a more direct, it's cutting down the middleman and going straight at the heart of museum education work. And we also want to emphasize context, So that's these are some of the things that we want to raise. So this is the museum organization now after the reorganization. I take care of the left field. And although it seems smaller than the right field, we actually I have actually most of the staff, no? So because we focus on the threefold mandate of the museum. So just to give you how complex and big organization that the kind of organization that we have, we actually have the central offices, which I pointed out a while ago. So, and then we actually have a regional network. So we have the regional museums and satellite offices. There's about 7 of them all over the country. So, so we actually cover quite a bit of the islands. We have 7,100 islands, so we try as much as possible to be there, to be present in the on site. So we also have like archaeological sites and caves that we look after. Well, one of the reasons why we have to be there is that there's no Ministry of Culture in the Philippines, but there's a pending bill in Congress, and they're looking into it very closely. So we could actually function more as a museums rather than take on regulatory responsibilities. So it's quite big. So what are my mandated outcomes and outputs? So these are really part of our work as a government institution. So we have to meet this. Our major final outputs are 2. One is the museum exhibit and educational services, and the other is the regulatory part of our work is cultural properties protection and preservation services. We actually have these key strategic and operational areas of activity and concern. This is required of us from the Department of Budget and Management. So we need to really be out there. And for instance, we didn't used to have this promotion of access. In fact, our old curators in the museum would rather not have visitors because they ruin the collections, they say. So that's the old idea. So we have to transform also our older generation of employees. So we have had really good accomplishments in the last 7 years that we've taken, managed the museum. So especially, for instance, with enhancing public programming aimed at, number 5, at wide and diverse audience development and inclusion of underprivileged or marginalized sectors. So in our museum, we have a task force that focuses on universal access. So it's not just the physically challenged, but also those who have always felt left out of the museum, like those belonging to marginalized economic sectors of the Philippines, and also those from indigenous communities. So I would like to emphasize on the idea of storytelling. What we are now promoting in the museum is for our researchers to tell a really good and compelling story, and to address a wider audience as much as possible. For instance, the level of the language that we use for extended captions for our brochures would be 5th grade in elementary school. So we would rather have that because we don't want to presume that people know where we're coming from, what our objects are about, what the museum is about. So we want to focus on the idea of intangible heritage. I think that's been overlooked a lot in museums, which is really more focused on objects and material culture. We also want to acknowledge the fact that in a lot of cases, for instance, when a country goes through a war, we lose quite a bit of material culture. So we have to reconstruct that through storytelling and gathering more information from the field. So, for instance, in the case of artworks in the museum, we now pretty much have to go through a retrospective study of the paintings that we have, especially those that we gathered in the early 20th century. And we're doing much more conservation in that sense too, that we want to know what the artist's materials and techniques were. So we also want to see how the communities valued the collections that we have in the museum. And I think it's very, very important. We don't collect for ourselves. We have to start asking, why are these collections in the museum? And who mandated those? Who collected them? So I want to focus on intangible heritage because it's a key framework for storytelling. So we want to focus on more non-physical heritage. Of course, UNESCO has given us this very important framework, and when they also created a new way of appreciating intangible heritage through the proclamations of masterpieces of oral intangible heritage of humanity. It also includes, as an anthropologist, I like the idea that it also acknowledges this notion of cultural space. So just to give you a brief background where this UNESCO program comes from. So it's the 1992, there was the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. There's also the setting up of the United Nations Decade for Indigenous and Minority People that became like the watershed for a lot of this awareness for intangible heritage. We also want to start regarding, for instance, traditional knowledge as part of the knowledge systems that are scientific and quite serious in terms of understanding, for instance, Philippine culture or even Southeast Asian culture. And the notion of sharing credit with, as I mentioned a while ago, it's about sharing credit with who used to be called just the informants, the key informants. So now they're our co-authors. So just to give you an example, this is a field that I've gone through very extensively. I worked with the Bontoc people up in the northern part, the highlands of Luzon. And so it's really been interesting how they don't have any design sketchbooks. Everything is up in their heads, and the template is up there. And there are instances where some weavers in the south of the Philippines would say that they dream about it. So it's really quite important that we know why this is that this is a value that they actually prize within their cultures. There's this one instance when the tattoos are actually used as mnemonic devices, and when I interviewed this woman, she actually said that because she forgets, that's one of the idea that her mental template is not very clear sometimes. So she decided that her tattoo should be a way for her to remember the designs for her textiles. So this has come, actually, all these research that we've done on textiles and other material culture involving weaving has gone into our Textile Gallery at the museum. It's a dedicated gallery for Philippine traditional textiles. So we have we've factored in even the technology, hand looms, backstrap looms, and foot looms were involved. And so we've also shown the beauty of all these textiles that are produced, in the Philippines and turned into garments. So we sometimes have visitors from indigenous communities. We actually encourage that. So they study all the textiles that we have, and they actually respond to them. Either they don't like them, or they like them, or they criticize them. So it's really quite an important factor in our work. And so these highland Luzon women were studying the looms of the southern highland women loom. So, and we actually bring them over to the museum as part of our public programs, and our audiences come around and learn about how difficult it is to weave with a backstrap loom. They said it's like a rowing machine. So it's a kind of part of their, they said they could engage in this like part of their physical fitness. What we also like is sometimes we bring in weavers who do not use looms, like for instance basket makers and also mat weavers. And so young people actually have more opportunities to engage with, not even if they don't know how to use a mechanical loom. So what we have done recently, for May 18, it's the International Museum Day, where we started talking about difficult histories, conflicting histories, is that we brought in our curators and researchers to do the guiding around the museum. This is one of our underwater cultural heritage archaeologists who has actually been involved in a lot of retrieval of shipwreck sites. And he's talking about a slab of granite that has Armenian incisions on them. So we've actually managed to get more people interested in that. Or we talk about conflict, objects that come out of conflict. And these are our adult sport tops that were used to be played in Mindanao, because it's where a lot of the Muslim communities actually reside. But because of the conflict that we have at the moment, a lot of these objects are coming out in antique dealer shops and all that. So we've began to acquire them, because eventually we said when peace has come to Mindanao, we will be setting up more, not just museums, but community centers, so that we could remind young people how these were played. Because if the adults are gone, who would tell them how to do this, and also to take pride in their cultural practices. We also managed to bring in people before we do any exhibitions. We try as much as possible to be consultative to the source communities of our objects. And these are the non-Muslim groups from Mindanao, the Lumad, and they tell us exactly, because some of our objects do not have provenance, they're just there. And so we do retrospective documentation of the objects that we have. We also like getting a lot of young people with so much enthusiasm. So this is our botanist. His area is actually ferns, because we have quite a big population of fern collection and also endemic species in the Philippines. But what he's doing now with these young kids from marginalized communities around Manila, he's talking about Rafflesia. And so he's actually now managed to develop a Rafflesia Club from among these kids. So they come around the Philippine National Herbarium and they volunteer to work with us in terms of mounting specimens and all that. So we've made also science a little bit sexier. So in terms of studying the our artworks in the collection, so we brought in the National Institute of Physics from the University of the Philippines to do 3D scanning of our paintings, and we show them some of the three-dimensional imaging of these paintings, especially when the paintings are very textured. So since last year, on July 1st, actually, 2016, we managed to convince the management, the trustees of the museum, to make the admission free to all our national museums. And in the beginning, they weren't convinced, but we said our mandate is really not revenue. We have to bring in more people because it's really part of it. Although, this seems like a milestone, I wasn't very happy that people were made to queue. And so we've developed a better system now so that they don't have to queue, because, in the tropics, it's really quite annoying to have to do that, and it's very hot. So again, in our recent engagement with the University of Melbourne, we developed a project to study the pigments in 19th century paintings. And this is part of our retrospective documentation of what we have. So we've had more volunteers from universities now, and soon we'll be bringing in senior high school students so that they can think about careers in museums. You know, having 235 more new positions in the museums is really quite a good thing. We're very lucky. But at the end of the day, it's really not a good thing if you don't have a pool of human resource to choose from. So it's starting the young people to think about careers in museums, that we want them to volunteer, for instance, in museums and see how cool it is to bring in science and study of materials and techniques in art collection, in our collections. So just a few final slides. No, I want to really talk about the because I was quite heavily invested in the intergovernmental meetings that took place in Paris about the promotion and protection of collections in museums and beyond that. So we really want to promote this. No? Especially the museum education aspect of our work really involves the idea that we want to promote collections, and one way of doing that is actually to start talking about collections in the sense that we didn't really used to, for instance, not to overly valorize objects, but really to find ways where the audience and our collections really have some common grounds. So I mean that's the aspect of why we need to bring in storytelling. We also want to talk about, as I mentioned, because conflict is sometimes just around our corner. So we have to talk about how we can protect our collections through for instance, the campaign of UNESCO in terms of Unite for Heritage. So what are the challenges to intangible heritage? Because I keep talking about it, but I think we also have to be mindful about the certain things that we have to look out for. For instance, intangible heritage is very fragile. There are certain events, for instance, that make people forget about certain practices. There's also risk of losing rich variations as a result of documentation that would tend to privilege one knowledge system over another. There's this project of the Department of Culture and the National Commission on Culture and the Arts in the Philippines, where these UNESCO inscribed intangible heritage, the hudhud, which is an epic chant, was being promoted in schools. But what has happened is that they actually promoted a central village's version of it, and the ones that are sang in the peripheral villages were not accepted. So the teachers were saying, when the school children started talking about their own or performing their own hudhud, they were saying that's the wrong version. So we have to start thinking, even if we have all these really lofty ideals and we want to do good, we have to kind of do much more work in terms of preparing for these programs. We also have now talked about the ownership of intellectual property. Should we perform that anywhere? If we have certain types of epics that we want to perform, who do we ask permission from? At the moment, our intellectual property office, which is under the Office of the President, they've actually now developed a system of protocol in terms of asking permission. We also have the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, so that we also have to abide by also their framework. It's a bit complicated. Normally, a lot of people are so used to just doing their own thing and doing research in the field. But I think it's overall a lot will produce much richer research if we try to consult as many people as possible. There's also, as I mentioned a while ago, the idea that what intangible heritage is not very scientific, it's very emotional and all that. But it's actually, we have to actually regard it as a system of scientific inquiry. And then, so we have to also be able to keep these memories. How do we keep them? What sorts of instruments do we use? And how do we transmit them? How do we know that the transmission is accurate or acceptable? So, for instance, we've had a lot of challenges in our UNESCO World Heritage sites, especially if they involve the environment and also the practice. We nearly lost the status for the Ifugao rice terraces because not many people are practicing rice cultivation in the site anymore. And I think it doesn't have to really be about about just rice cultivation, but it also is the whole lifestyle that revolves around supporting this kind of practice. So we finally we were taken out of the state of conservation and the negative aspect of state of conservation in the World Heritage Committee list, so that we could actually now again promote this as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and also find ways to support the people who are actually involved in maintaining these rice terraces. So what we have done at the museum is to support a 5-year project that was initiated by a stakeholder who's a PhD graduate from the University of Guam, and then he eventually moved to the UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles. And this has to do with, for instance, dating the rice terraces, because in the UNESCO literature, it says it's over 2,000 years old. And so when we did the archaeology on different sites within the UNESCO inscribed terraces region, we found out that actually the terraces were not 2,000 years old. It's just 800 years old. It's just that at the time when all these archaeologists and anthropologists were documenting the site, they just couldn't believe that over a short period of time, the natives in this area were managed to actually build the terraces for such a short period. So sometimes we're so enamored with the idea of, the long age, the very old age. But actually, what we have to celebrate in, for instance, the Philippines example, is that we actually are able to respond to changes in conditions, for instance, environment or even colonialism, and that because the certain terraces that are just 500 years old were actually connected with a lot of people moving from the lowland to the highlands and trying to escape Spanish colonialism in the Philippines. So these are some of the images that we've worked on. We found that the terraces were actually residences in the past. So we found beads and human remains and animal remains. And but at the same time, we have to work with also contemporary peoples that actually cultivate the terraces. And these are women performing the hud in the epic chant while they're actually harvesting. So what we want to do is actually also start looking at historical objects in our museums and elsewhere. This is a program that we were engaged with a long time ago, looking at some of the objects in Southeast Asian objects in, for instance, Leiden in the Netherlands. So anyway, I just want to end with a very happy note that we're opening a natural history museum at the end of this year. It's been delayed for a year already. Museum building, museum development is not really very, it's not easy. We have to work with people. That's primarily what we need to do. We can't just put up displays and think that people will just come because we have it and we built it. We need to maintain, sustain. We need to develop lifelong learners and lifelong audiences. We want more people to feel that the museum, the National Museum, is theirs, and that all takes work. That all takes consultation, and the challenges are enormous. But on the whole, we really love the idea that more people feel that the museum is theirs. We've looked at the social media accounts of some of our visitors or audiences, and we find that they've even used for their profile pictures some of our collections. So that's a happy note. So Kabkun ka. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ana Maria Theresa Labrador, for your wonderful keynote speech. Now I would like to welcome you all. If you have questions or you have anything to share with Dr. Ana, please be comfortable to do so. ก็ขอบพระคุณดร. Ana นะครับแล้วก็ตอนนี้ถ้าท่านผู้ฟังมีคำถามหรือมีประเด็นอยากจะแลกเปลี่ยนก็เรียนเชิญนะครับถ้าพูดเป็นภาษาอังกฤษได้ก็พูดภาษาอังกฤษไปเลยนะครับก่อนครับขออนุญาตนะครับครับสวัสดีทุกท่านนะครับ and welcome again Ana Maria and thank you so much for being here on behalf of a Thai museum education scene. We are so happy to see your presentation again this year, and congratulations for making your museum really accessible by not having an entrance fee. I think that's a big milestone. A quick question from me, and I'll ask this in English and Thai, so we can have a bit of an idea. I'm really interested in the idea of duality that you mentioned, especially on the idea of working with, intangible heritage. And this idea, I think we kind of have similar thing in Thailand where education work, especially with intangible heritage that have performative quality, are looked at as romantic add-on to the scientific curation work. Yeah. So how do you deal? I think you touched on a little bit already that some of your staff still have very different attitude towards incorporating education work into the main work of the museum, So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the attitude of your staff, and how do you incorporate education, especially with intangible heritage, with your working process from the very beginning? ก็ขอถามนะครับว่าคือปกติคนทำงานพิพิธภัณฑ์เนี่ยจะมองงานการศึกษาโดยเฉพาะงานการศึกษากับวัฒนธรรมว่าเป็นเรื่องโรแมนติกเรื่องพรุ้งพริ้งนะที่เราแอดออนที่เป็นส่วนเสริมสิ่งที่ซีเรียสหรือว่าสิ่งที่เป็นเนื้อหาจริงๆซึ่งก็คืองานคิวเรชั่นหรืองานทำงานกับสิ่งของนะฮะอยากถามคุณแอนนามาเรียว่าทำยังไงที่สามารถเปลี่ยนแปลงแนวคิดของผู้ทำงานในพิพิธภัณฑ์นะฮะว่างานการศึกษาเนี่ยมันไม่ใช่แค่เรื่องที่เสริมไปตอนท้ายแต่ทำยังไงให้งานการศึกษาร่วมกับพิพิธภัณฑ์แล้วก็คิวเรเตอร์พันธลักษณ์ตั้งแต่ต้นครับ
I think your question is quite complex, but I'll try to answer as much as I can. With regards to our older staff, we really had to kind of, in a way, develop a boot camp for them. Because to them, they've taken seriously this idea of knowledge is power, and the power rests on them. And they don't want to give up that power. And so we have to, what we've been doing is, even if they are kind of physically not there, we bring them to the field and appreciate that actually that's where power rests, you know, from this people from whom we build our careers on. And so we've actually kind of made some changes, but of course, sometimes it's true that you can't teach all these new tricks to them. And so, but I think they're pretty happy with relinquishing some of that power now because they don't have that energy. And that's why it's important to bring in younger people to the museum. We're, how old this year? 116 years, 116 years old this year, quite old. So we want to rejuvenate the museum in that sense. So one of the things really that we have to really focus on is that the traditional knowledge is very, very scientific. And you can't get that information if our researchers just swoop in, like parachute in the field. We had to find ways as managers, as a manager for research, I had to find ways to find the money to make them stay longer in the field so that they could engage much more. Because we have to actually also admit that the members of the indigenous communities are suffering from research fatigue. Meaning to say it's always one way. It's like we're miners. We extract all this knowledge from them, but we don't really give anything back. And so that's why it's important that we have regional presence all over the Philippines, so that the staff that we've taken from them, from their area, would be returned to them. And that works for us too, because we're creating destinations. So we'd say, for instance, you want to find the original Manunggul jar from Palawan, Tabon Caves, go to Palawan and have a look there. What we have here is just a replica, a reproduction. So it's a lot better. We can promote it, promote these collections in Manila, but then if they want to see the real thing, and this is what I really want to emphasize is that our advantage as museums is that we have real stuff, and because the young people especially are so surrounded by virtual reality stuff that to them it's now become attractive to see the real thing, and the very specific character of materials are something that they're now kind of engaging with. But it really helps if you're a good storyteller, and that's what I've been trying to also develop in me, to tell a compelling story. So that's really the thing. Did I answer your question? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. ไม่ทราบมีแปลหรือเปล่าครับเมื่อสักครู่สรุปก็ได้ไหมฮะสรุปนิดหนึ่งผมอาจจะไม่ได้อยู่ในบริบทนี้เท่าไหร่แต่ว่าก็คือพาเจ้าหน้าที่ลงสนามเพื่อให้เจ้าหน้าที่ไปและเขาบอกว่าในฐานะที่เป็นผู้ดูแลในเรื่องการวิจัยเขาต้องหาเงินมาให้เยอะๆเหมือนกันเพื่อให้เจ้าหน้าที่สามารถอยู่ในสนามได้นานที่สุดเพื่อที่จะเก็บข้อมูลและทำความเข้าใจประเด็นทางวัฒนธรรมที่มันอยู่ในสนามแล้วก็เขาบอกว่าผมสรุปเขาบอกว่าคนรุ่นใหม่เนี่ยซึ่งเป็นเจ้าหน้าที่เนี่ยส่วนใหญ่ก็จะอยู่กับสิ่งที่มันเป็นความจริง virtual เนี่ยนะฮะเป็นอะไรนะความจริงสมมุติใช่ไหมฮะแต่ว่าดังนั้นในการพาไปลงสนามมันก็จะทำให้เขาได้เห็นสิ่งที่เป็นจริงนะซึ่งก็อาจจะเป็นซึ่งนี่ก็คงเป็นกลยุทธ์หนึ่งที่เพื่อที่ตอบคำถามที่ถามมานะครับผมเรียนเชิญอาจารย์ปริตาครับ
Thank you very much, Dr. Labrador, for your very inspiring talk. You must be a very good storyteller.
I hope so.
Now, my question concerns this intangible cultural heritage. I think as you are both social anthropologist and curator, you must be aware of so many critiques that anthropologists have presented on this issue of UNESCO's definition of intangible cultural heritage. You have mentioned some of it in your talk. Basically, it's the idea that documenting it or collecting it, in fact, is going against the grain of and nature of intangible cultural heritage, which is something that is constantly changing, very dynamic, very fluid. Do you agree or not agree with these critiques? And as a curator, how do you overcome this divide between the kind of critical analysis on the one hand and the need to represent as a museum curator on the other hand?
Okay. Thank you for your question. That's really quite compelling stuff. We actually have to work within the UNESCO framework because we are government, and so we're very mindful of that because we are one of the signatories in supporting UNESCO. But our attitude is that they are really just the framework, and that we could deviate from it based on what we've been documenting in the field. And sometimes we really get it wrong, even if we have the best of intentions. And the main idea is to have an attitude that we don't hold all the power also in terms of exercising certain types of programs. There's a constant dialogue now. In fact, I just came from a meeting last week regarding the ethics, the framework for collecting data from the field, and even now because of this human genome project that's become also an issue. So there are a lot of criticisms, and even in terms of how we put together some of the exhibitions. But the idea is to have a flexible mind and also an open-ended approach to even our public programs, and I think we're all the richer for it if we actually work with communities closer. In fact, that's the problem in the past, and I think UNESCO is a dynamic institutions because I've worked with some of their offices, and then that they too are very willing to change some of the long-held notions. Like now we're campaigning to change the dates of the rice terraces because that was in the dossier, and so we're working through our national committee so that could be changed in the official documents of the UNESCO. I think we all have kind of the best of intentions in terms of putting forward our cultural heritage, but sometimes we have different approaches to them, and I think we shouldn't really be we should really accept the criticisms. That's really part of growing. I certainly get a dose also as an anthropologist, and I think that the idea is to see that knowledge is also part of a humbling practice. Acquiring knowledge is also part of that. Thank you. So is that is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. ผมกังวลเพราะว่าผมอาจจะไม่สามารถแปลนี้ได้เพราะผมไม่ค่อยเข้าใจในเชิงบริบทนะฮะตอนนี้กำลังจะ 10:30 นะครับไม่ทราบมีท่านใดอยากถามหรืออยากแสดงความคิดเห็นเพิ่มเติมไหมครับผม
Hello, Anna.
Hello.
As museum planner, I wonder how do you come across with, or how do you convince your colleague, your government to work on community project or community engagement before opening a museum? Because in Thailand, it's such a vicious circle that when government planning museum or when someone planning museum, they just go straight to architect firm or exhibition firm and put the design on or curator on and expect that when it open, people will come. So we see that you do work differently in the Philippines, but before you get there, how do you convince your colleagues or your boss or the government to go along to that process? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. It's really with a lot of difficulty. It's years of struggling with the idea that you just cannot subcontract putting together a museum. Although that's I think that's the comfort zone of a lot of trustees, that they think that the expertise lie elsewhere. One of the things that we had to struggle with is that some of our trustees did not believe that the wow factor is not in the architecture or of the building, but it's actually with the collections and the staff. But that's really pushing things to a different direction. So the idea is not to give up, to just really keep talking about how important it is that what we are actually focusing on is the collection. A lot of museum planning, museum building starts with the building, and it shouldn't. It should really be with putting together a good story. I'm sorry, I have to keep pushing this storytelling thing, but it's really what would be a good story for people to take back with them after they visit the museum, and it starts really with the collections, and kind of even talk about why certain collections are in the museum and why there aren't certain collections, why are they elsewhere. And so it took some time, and now we've actually managed to get our curators and researchers to put together exhibitions. The other thing is really the staff, because we are a government agency. They can pretty much not do any work and then just take in their salaries. And so we've changed that idea. We've put targets monthly, and sometimes in some cases weekly targets. And so we want them to actually do the work that they are supposed to be doing, and that's to take pride also in the projects. So we've made them talk to each other. So before an exhibition, for instance, we would have discussions, and I'll for instance put together an interdisciplinary team. It has people from the anthropology, from natural history, from the arts, and because that's what really would tell a compelling story. It's about life, So or how people lived. So that's how they started doing their own projects, their own exhibitions. It used to be subcontracted out. It's the same elsewhere, but we didn't want that. We want them to actually, after putting up exhibitions or putting together public programs, I want them to be able to talk about that and be the best guides for the museum. So it's like a really a shift in how museums actually are put together here in Southeast Asia. So I think they're doing it better elsewhere, like in Europe or North America or even Latin America, but I think it's really ripe for us to start doing things on our own. So, is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ana. I'm afraid we can't have any longer time for this session because we have to proceed to another session. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.